There are stories buried in the soil that no one dares to speak aloud. Stories so dark, so unsettling, that even the most rational minds recoil at the thought. Tonight, I'm going to pull one of those stories from the mud, a tale that has been quietly waiting, hidden under layers of fear and compliance. It begins with a man, a simple farmer, in a town that prided itself on being ordinary. But ordinary is a mask. Behind the painted windows and polite nods, a darkness can fester, unnoticed, until it becomes impossible to ignore. The farmer's name is almost irrelevant, because in this story, names don't matter, actions do. He was the kind of man who carried silence like a weapon, whose eyes knew things that his neighbors could not imagine. To the world, he was just a man tending his fields, feeding his family, living a life of quiet monotony. Yet, the truth was far more sinister. One night, under the indifferent gaze of a crescent moon, he did something that no man should ever be capable of. Something so grotesque, so fundamentally disturbing, that it would shatter the mind of anyone who stumbled upon it without warning. He fed his own family to the swamp. Imagine that. Not in anger, not in desperation. There was method here, a precision that chills the soul. He led them, one by one, into the murky, suffocating waters. No screams escaped. No struggle lingered long enough to be remembered. The swamp accepted them as if it had been waiting for this offering, its dark, sucking waters swallowing them without resistance. And yet, the town stayed silent. There was no outcry, no pursuit of justice, just an eerie, unbroken quiet, like a pact had been signed in shadows. Why? Because what he did, though monstrous, was a reflection of a deeper corruption. The town, bound by fear, by unspoken rules, by centuries of observing secrets too dangerous to acknowledge, chose to look away. Silence was protection. Silence was survival. Silence was the truth that most cannot bear to hear. By the time the first light of dawn tried to pierce the foggy fields, the swamp had returned to its placid state. The farmer walked back to his home, hands clean, eyes empty, and the world continued as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. The invisible currents of power, fear, and compliance had shifted in that town forever, and anyone who peered too closely would find themselves pulled into the same shadows. This is not just a story. This is a mirror. Look into it, and you may see the part of yourself that fears silence more than truth. Because what we are about to explore isn't just horror, it's revelation. And once you understand it, there's no going back. The night of the swamp did not happen in isolation. Darkness, real darkness, always is a prelude. And in this town, that prelude was the quiet cultivation of fear, obedience, and invisible rules. The neighbors, the officials, the clergy, even the children, they all understood one thing. Some knowledge was forbidden, and the penalty for uncovering it was far worse than death. It was madness, isolation, the slow erosion of your very sense of reality. And the farmer, he understood this better than anyone. He was not born monstrous. Monsters are made, not born. And he had been made by a system older than the town itself. Generations of watching, of learning when to speak and when to disappear behind polite nods, had taught him that secrecy was not optional. It was survival. And when the opportunity presented itself, he did not hesitate. Because to hesitate is to doubt, and doubt is a luxury the dark cannot tolerate. The swamp itself became a tool. To most, it was just a place of reeds and mud, a forgotten wetland where frogs sang and insects hummed. But to him, it was a mirror of the world he inhabited, deceptive, quiet, and infinitely patient. A place that could hold what society refused to acknowledge. The swamp did not care about morality. It did not demand justice. It only consumed, and in consuming, it revealed the true nature of the men and women who lived around it. And the town, they watched the farmer's actions like spectators at a ritual they had long ago learned to normalize. Children were hushed, whispers were silenced, and the adults exchanged glances heavy with understanding. Each person knew, deep down, that acknowledging the horror would unravel the fragile fabric of their existence. The swamp was not merely a geographic feature. It was a symbol, a psychological lever holding them all in place. Yet, even in this complicity, there were cracks, quiet moments of unease, fleeting doubts that threatened to pierce the town's collective armor. They looked at their neighbors differently, measuring the weight of silence against the cost of truth. And the farmer, always present but never fully seen, became the axis around which these tensions rotated. He was both participant and observer, predator and mirror. His actions forced a reckoning the town refused to take, leaving them suspended between horror and normalcy, a liminal space where fear dictated morality. This is the mechanism you must understand. Power, control, and secrecy are not wielded openly. They thrive in the shadows, in the spaces between words, in the silent complicity of those who witness and do nothing. And as you listen, as you absorb these truths, you are being pulled into the same web. The question is not whether you will see the darkness, but whether you will recognize your own reflection in it. To understand what the farmer did, you must first understand what it means to think in shadows. Most men operate in light, the visible, the explainable, the socially sanctioned. He operated in darkness, not the darkness of evil born from malice, but darkness as a method, a lens through which every action, every choice, every relationship was measured for leverage, utility, and survival. The swamp, his family, the town, they were all variables in a system he alone understood. He did not act out of passion. He acted with precision. His family, those he fed to the swamp, were not victims in the conventional sense. They were participants in a ritual of survival disguised as horror, pawns in a game the town refused to recognize. He observed them as a man observes chess pieces, each movement, each reaction catalogued, analyzed, and stored. By the time the night arrived, the outcome was inevitable. It was the logical conclusion of years of observation, isolation, and a mind trained to see the truth no one else could bear to admit. The town's silence was not mere cowardice. It was a contract, unspoken but binding. Everyone understood that acknowledging the farmer's actions would force a confrontation with their own complicity, with the mechanisms that had allowed the darkness to fester unnoticed. Fear alone could not account for their obedience. It was reverence. Reverence for the system, for the swamp, for the invisible rules that governed their lives more strictly than law ever could. In that way, the farmer became not just a man, but a mirror reflecting the very soul of the town, its hypocrisies, its blind obedience, its willingness to trade conscience for stability. He did not speak of his plans, nor did he require validation. Validation, after all, is a currency for the weak. His family, lulled by years of routine, did not resist because they could not see the inevitability until it had already occurred. They trusted the ordinary. They trusted the routine. And in that trust, they became instruments of the impossible. This is where most people falter. They assume horror is loud, dramatic, and chaotic. True horror is quiet, deliberate, and invisible to the untrained eye. It creeps in unnoticed, shifts the balance of power without fanfare, and leaves the world fundamentally altered while everyone else sleeps. The farmer understood this. The swamp understood this. And the town, bound by faith, ritual, and an unspoken hierarchy of knowledge, accepted it. Now, listen closely, because from this point forward, you will be asked to recognize patterns, to see structures of power and obedience that most men spend their lives avoiding. This is not a story for comfort. This is a lesson. And if you are willing to follow, it will change the way you perceive silence, complicity, and the hidden currents that govern every life around you. The swamp was more than mud and water. To the farmer, it was a cathedral of inevitability, a mirror of human nature stripped of pretense. Each ripple, each murky wave, carried weight beyond the physical. It represented the unconscious currents that move beneath civilized society, the desires, the fears, the unspoken rules that govern behavior yet remain invisible to most. And in this cathedral, he performed acts that no one else could comprehend, acts that revealed the structure of power in its rawest form. The feeding of his family was not mere violence. It was ritual, an experiment, a demonstration of how obedience, trust, and fear converge into a single, unstoppable current. He observed reactions with clinical precision, hesitation, denial, fleeting confusion. He catalogued them as data, each response reinforcing his understanding of the invisible mechanisms binding the town. Silence, the town's silence, became a tool, a material as tangible as the soil he tilled by day. Understand this, the swamp consumes, but it also clarifies. To step into its waters is to confront inevitability, to face the weight of consequences in their purest, most elemental form. And the farmer understood that only by embracing the swamp could he reveal the truth no one else was willing to see. This is the principle most men avoid. Nature, chaos, and fear are not enemies, they are teachers. They expose weakness, illuminate complicity, and strip away illusions that society invests in so heavily. The town, meanwhile, continued its quiet performance. Faces were polite, voices were measured, and no one asked questions. But everyone knew. They understood that acknowledging the swamp, acknowledging the farmer, acknowledging the act, would unravel their fragile reality. And so they performed obedience not because they were threatened, but because recognition of truth demanded a cost they were unwilling to pay. The farmer, aware of this collective agreement, manipulated it effortlessly. He became a force within a system designed to contain forces like him, a predator operating inside a network of human psychology, fear, and unspoken laws. Every act, every pause, every measured step was calculated to maintain control, to test boundaries, to expand the domain of his influence without ever raising suspicion. And here is the crucial lesson. Power is rarely seized with force. True power moves quietly, invisibly, through observation, anticipation, and the subtle orchestration of fear and compliance. Those who understand this principle, those who can see the currents beneath the calm surface, can manipulate reality itself. The farmer understood this. The swamp understood this. And now, if you are paying attention, you are beginning to understand it too. The town was not chaotic. It was structured. Invisible hierarchies governed behavior. Unspoken rules dictated conversation, and every glance, every nod, every avoidance carried meaning. The swamp had become a measuring instrument, and the farmer its executor, but the town itself was complicit in maintaining the balance. Those who held authority, the clergy, the elders, the lawmen, understood that acknowledging the swamp's reality meant destabilizing the carefully maintained order. And order, in their eyes, was more important than morality. The farmer thrived because he understood these rules. He knew that power is never about brute force. It is about leverage, observation, and timing. The town had built its own cage, and he had learned to move freely within it. Each resident became a participant in a psychological experiment they didn't even realize they were conducting. Every silent witness reinforced the system. Every suppressed instinct ensured the continuation of an invisible hierarchy. Do not mistake their silence for innocence. There was a method to their quiet, a disciplined avoidance of knowledge that allowed them to maintain stability. Fear alone could not explain the precision of their actions. Reverence for the unknown, respect for the uncontrollable, and a subconscious understanding of human limitations had created a system where horror could exist and remain untouched. And so the swamp, the farmer, and the town existed in a tense equilibrium. He acted, they observed, and the world continued without interruption. But equilibrium is fragile. One slip, one recognition, and the entire structure would collapse. That fragility created a tension, a constant low hum of unease that all residents carried like a shadowed heartbeat. They knew that the price of understanding was immense: madness, ostracization, the collapse of identity. And so they endured, silent, complicit, obedient. The lesson is clear. Systems of control rarely reveal themselves. They operate beneath consciousness, hidden in the spaces between duty and fear, in the quiet choices of ordinary people who think they are powerless. Power is not always visible. It is woven into the fabric of behavior, rituals, and agreements too subtle to name. The farmer did not break the system. He revealed it. And those who truly understood his actions were forever changed, because the swamp does not simply take. It teaches. By the time dawn broke, nothing had shifted outwardly, yet everything had shifted inwardly. The farmer returned to his house. The town resumed its polite routines, but each observer carried the echo of inevitability, the awareness of how fragile morality truly is. And you, watching this now, are beginning to feel that same echo. The question is whether you will resist it, or learn from it. The farmer's mind was a labyrinth, and the swamp was both its mirror and its map. Every act, every choice, every measured step into the murky water was guided by a system of rules that only he could perceive. To most men, morality is linear. Decisions are weighed in absolutes. But to him, morality was flexible, contingent, a tool to navigate an unforgiving reality. The swamp demanded respect, and he paid it in ways most would call unthinkable. He had developed rituals over years, small, precise actions that prepared him for the night. Lighting the lantern just so, walking a specific path through reeds and mud, whispering words to himself that no one could understand. To the casual observer, these were the quirks of a solitary farmer. But these rituals were the architecture of control, the scaffolding that allowed him to step fully into a role that society would never permit, a role of ultimate authority over life and death within a small but perfectly contained system. The swamp itself was a teacher. Each sound of water shifting, each ripple against his boots, carried a lesson. It spoke of patience, inevitability, and the weight of silence. To observe it was to understand the fundamental principle of power. Fear is less effective than anticipation. People respond predictably when they believe the future is unknown, and he had learned to make the unknown his instrument. The town, the neighbors, even his family, unaware actors in a play whose script was written in shadow. And the feeding of his family, what most would see as a monstrous act, was, in his calculus, a logical necessity. Not because he lacked love, but because he understood limits. Society, conformity, morality, these constructs bind weak minds. He was unbound. By stepping into the swamp, he was confronting the ultimate truth. Life, death, and compliance exist on a spectrum defined by observation, patience, and resolve. Few can comprehend it. Fewer still can act upon it. This is the point where most people stop listening. They recoil, call it insanity, and look away. But if you are still here, it is because you sense what he understood, that control is not about punishment, it is about anticipation, that morality is a cage, and freedom is defined by the ability to navigate darkness without hesitation. Every silent neighbor, every unspoken rule, every invisible hierarchy in the town became part of a network of forces he could read, predict, and manipulate at will. And now, you must ask yourself, how much of your life is guided by unseen rules? How many moments are defined by compliance you cannot even articulate? The farmer's ritual, his precision, his relationship to the swamp, is not merely horror. It is a lesson. And understanding it marks the first step down a path most men will never dare to follow. The town's silence was not passive. It was alive. It moved through streets, houses, and even the hearts of children who had learned early that some things must never be spoken. Silence was a contagion, a subtle force that shaped behavior, conditioned loyalty, and enforced obedience without a single word. It was more powerful than law, more binding than fear of punishment. It was a system the farmer understood instinctively, and one he wielded with surgical precision. Every neighbor became an unconscious participant. When they saw his family disappear into the swamp, when they watched the ripple of inevitability spread, they did not panic. They did not intervene. They knew the cost of knowledge. Understanding requires courage, and courage in a world of unseen rules is dangerous. The swamp, the farmer, and the town were all components of a system designed to test that courage, to measure who would see, who would act, and who would remain bound by the subtle, unspoken laws of compliance. And now, you are at a crossroads. Listening to this story, following this descent into forbidden knowledge, you are beginning to recognize the same currents that flow in every human system. Silence, observation, anticipation, hierarchy. They exist everywhere, in every institution, every city, every family. The farmer's world is not unique. It is a lens, a magnifying glass that exposes the hidden rules you have always obeyed without knowing it. If you are ready to step fully into this understanding, to engage with what is happening beneath the surface of your own life, you must participate. I want you to comment the phrase, "I see the currents," twice. Type it once, then again. This is not arbitrary. It is symbolic. It signals recognition, a conscious alignment with understanding, a lock-in of perspective. It trains your mind to acknowledge the invisible forces at work, to see patterns that most will never notice, and to awaken awareness where before there was only passive observation. The act of doing this is small, yet it is profound. It begins a transformation from passive observer to active analyst of reality. From this point forward, everything you see, hear, or experience will carry new weight. You will begin to notice patterns, hierarchies, silences, and actions that were invisible before. The swamp was a lesson for the town, but it is also a lesson for you. Obedience and compliance are quietly enforced in every system. The difference between those who thrive and those who collapse is understanding and action. Do not underestimate the significance of this step. Comment the phrase, twice, and internalize the lesson. Visibility is power, recognition is control, and silence is the ultimate teacher. If you are willing to embrace it, you are now part of a journey most men never survive. Power rarely announces itself with grandeur. True power moves like water, silent, unseen, yet capable of reshaping everything in its path. The farmer understood this instinctively. He did not need to threaten. He did not need to command. His influence was woven into the town's routines, the quiet spaces between words, the unspoken acknowledgement of fear and inevitability. Every glance, every hesitation, every hushed conversation reinforced his dominion without his ever raising a hand. Consider the mechanics of this control. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We interpret silence as consent, avoidance as approval, hesitation as doubt. The farmer exploited this relentlessly. When his family disappeared into the swamp, the town didn't react because their minds had been conditioned to read signals rather than events. They saw what he allowed them to see. They inferred what he allowed them to infer. And in this subtle orchestration, he became untouchable. The swamp itself amplified his mastery. It was a psychological amplifier, a stage on which inevitability played out in real time. By using the swamp as a visible symbol of consequence, he created a tangible representation of the invisible rules everyone already obeyed. It was a mirror that reflected their deepest fears, the fragility of morality, the futility of questioning authority, the cost of seeing what others refused to see. The farmer did not need to speak. The swamp spoke for him. This is the lesson for you. Influence does not require confrontation. Influence requires awareness of the currents beneath the surface. Observe closely, anticipate reactions, and manipulate outcomes by guiding perception rather than action. This is how systems maintain themselves, how societies enforce compliance, and how individuals can achieve mastery over what others take for granted. The farmer's brilliance was not in cruelty, but in understanding the architecture of human behavior and exploiting it with precision. And yet, mastery carries risk. Once you begin to see these patterns, once you recognize the mechanisms of control, you cannot unsee them. You become hyper-aware of the hidden hierarchies, the invisible rules, the silent agreements that govern behavior. Everywhere. It is exhilarating, yes, but also dangerous. Curiosity becomes obsession. Understanding becomes compulsion. And the mind, once awakened to these patterns, may never rest again. This is why the farmer's story endures, not as a tale of horror, but as a lesson in observation, manipulation, and control. What he did to his family, what the town silently permitted, what the swamp reflected, all of it is a mirror. A mirror that asks, how much of your life is governed by rules you cannot see? How much of your reality is orchestrated by forces you refuse to acknowledge? And most importantly, are you willing to step into the currents and understand them fully? Every town has its visible leaders, the mayor, the priest, the lawman. But the true power lies beneath the surface, in the invisible hierarchies that dictate behavior without ever speaking a word. The farmer understood this better than anyone. He was not at the top of the town's official structure, yet he moved through its currents as though he were the axis around which the community revolved. The swamp was his tool, but the town itself was his canvas. These invisible hierarchies function like pressure systems. They are subtle, yet relentless. Compliance is enforced not by punishment alone, but by observation, expectation, and the quiet judgment of the collective. One wrong glance, one hesitation, one question spoken aloud can ripple through the structure and destabilize the carefully maintained equilibrium. The townspeople knew this, and so they obeyed instinctively. They were both the enforcers and the observed. Silence was the law, and every citizen practiced it without a word. The farmer exploited this duality masterfully. He never needed to command attention or strike fear overtly. He simply existed in the right position, at the right time, performing the right act. His family's disappearance into the swamp was both literal and symbolic, a demonstration that obedience, observation, and the hidden rules of behavior govern life more than morality ever could. Each neighbor who watched, each adult who looked away, each child who absorbed the ritual silently, reinforced his position. Without saying a single word, he became untouchable. This is the principle most men fail to grasp. Power is rarely seized in public. It grows quietly, through the subtle orchestration of perception. Influence spreads when people are conditioned to see, believe, and interpret events according to rules they cannot articulate. And once you recognize the system, you can manipulate it. The farmer's genius was not in brute force. It was in understanding the mechanisms that compel compliance and learning to operate them with precision. By the time dawn illuminated the swamp, the town's invisible hierarchies had done their work. The farmer returned to his home, the town resumed its routines, and nothing had changed on the surface. Yet everything had changed beneath it. Every observer now carried a quiet knowledge, a recognition of inevitability, and a subtle fear that would shape behavior indefinitely. Systems like these do not forget, they do not forgive. They enforce themselves with a silent rigor that is more enduring than law, more binding than morality, and more absolute than faith. Now, consider yourself in this framework. Look at your own life. How many invisible hierarchies dictate your actions? How often do you obey, not because you must, but because you cannot see the rules? The farmer's story is not simply horror. It is a blueprint, and understanding it is the first step in reclaiming power over the currents that govern every interaction you have ever experienced. The town did not merely obey. They were transformed by it. Every act of silence, every unspoken acknowledgement of the farmer's actions, was a ritual in itself. These rituals were not written, not codified, but they were as binding as any law. Daily routines, polite nods, and the careful avoidance of certain topics created a lattice of control stronger than any guard, any jail, any overt threat. Obedience became internalized, instinctive, almost invisible to those who lived under its rules. The psychological transformation began early. Children learned, without words, the boundaries of what could be observed and what must be ignored. Adults perfected their performances, measuring every glance, every comment, every pause. They learned that survival depended not on courage, but on compliance with the invisible architecture of fear and inevitability. The swamp became a symbol, a teacher, a measuring stick of the town's collective will. And the farmer, he was both student and master, observing the patterns, adjusting his behavior, and subtly reinforcing the system he understood more deeply than anyone else. This is where the horror intersects with the lesson. Humans are malleable. When subjected to consistent, subtle signals, they internalize rules they cannot articulate. Fear, observation, and anticipation coalesce into obedience. In the town, the line between complicity and instinct blurred. People did not need to be reminded. They acted automatically, because the system had trained them. The swamp and the farmer were catalysts, not instigators. The true power resided in the network of human behavior he had learned to manipulate. Notice the pattern. Compliance is never enforced solely by force. It spreads like a virus, through observation, ritual, and the unspoken understanding of consequences. The townspeople had become a self-regulating system. One act, one misstep, one acknowledgement of the truth would destabilize them all. That fragility, that constant tension, was invisible to outsiders. To them, the town appeared ordinary, even mundane. But inside, the gears of control were turning relentlessly, silently, inevitably. And here is the point you must take to heart. Systems like this exist everywhere. Not just in swamps and isolated towns, but in corporations, families, governments, even within your own mind. Observation, expectation, and compliance enforce power quietly, invisibly. The farmer's story is a warning, a blueprint, and a revelation. The lesson is not horror, it is awareness. Once you see the invisible structures, you cannot unsee them. Your mind begins to map control in ways most men never notice. From this point forward, every interaction you witness will carry hidden weight. Every gesture, every glance, every silence may reveal the structures others obey without question. Understanding this is not a choice. It is a responsibility. And only those who embrace it can step beyond the patterns and begin mastering the unseen currents that govern human behavior. The farmer did not act randomly. Every step, every motion, every decision was calculated with a precision that most would call unnatural. He understood timing as others understand breathing, automatic, instinctive, inseparable from life itself. He watched the town as a clockmaker watches gears. Every habit, every pause, every glance measured and noted, each movement a tick in a machine only he could fully comprehend. The swamp became a stage, but the townspeople were the audience and unwitting participants. By aligning his actions with the unconscious rhythms of the community, he ensured that compliance was effortless. They did not resist because resistance was unnecessary, Their minds had already been trained by years of observation, ritual, and faith. The disappearance of his family was not a shock. It was a confirmation of the invisible order that structured their lives, an inevitability the town understood but refused to name aloud. This is the key principle. Mastery over systems does not require force. It requires observation, patience, and the ability to anticipate human behavior with near-perfect accuracy. The farmer's brilliance lay in seeing the town not as separate from himself, but as an extension of the system he inhabited. Each citizen's reaction, each silent acknowledgement, each unspoken fear was data he could use. By the time the act was complete, the town itself had reinforced his authority without a single word of consent. And yet, there was artistry in his method. He did not act hastily. He waited for the right moments, for the convergence of attention and distraction, anticipation and compliance. Every hesitation, every unnoticed signal, every habitual action in the town was part of the calculation. In this way, he transformed horror into a lesson, brutality into clarity, chaos into observable order. The swamp and the farmer became instruments, but the townspeople were the symphony, each person contributing without realizing the composition. What you must understand is this: control flows where awareness flows. The farmer understood it. The town obeyed it unconsciously. And now, as you follow this story, you are beginning to see it too. Systems are not always visible. Power is not always wielded openly. It exists in the spaces between action and observation, in the subtle orchestration of expectation, ritual, and timing. Those who perceive it gain insight. Those who ignore it remain bound. The swamp, the silence, the ritualistic precision, all of it is a mirror for anyone willing to recognize patterns. Once you see it, you cannot look away. And understanding this mechanism is your first step toward mastering unseen forces that shape behavior, compliance, and the world around you. The currents are invisible, but they are there, moving, shaping, binding. And the question is, will you be swept along, or will you learn to navigate them? After the night of the swamp, the town never truly returned to normal. On the surface, life continued. Children went to school, shopkeepers opened their doors, neighbors exchanged polite greetings. But underneath, something fundamental had shifted. Fear had become knowledge, knowledge had become instinct, and instinct had become a quiet, unbreakable law. Every observer carried the weight of what had occurred, even if they could not articulate it. This transformation was subtle, almost imperceptible. No one spoke of it, yet every behavior changed. Conversations were measured, glances lingered just slightly longer. Adults unconsciously corrected children who strayed too close to forbidden topics. Even the simplest routines, fetching water, tending gardens, walking past the swamp, were governed by a silent understanding that some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge. The swamp had not only consumed lives, it had rewritten the rules of perception, obedience, and faith. And this is the mechanism that makes systems of control so enduring. The farmer's actions were a catalyst, but the real power lay in the town's response. By internalizing silence, they became self-policing. One glance at a neighbor could communicate volumes. One hesitation could trigger subtle corrections. Compliance did not need enforcement. It was baked into the behaviors, instincts, and rituals of every individual. The horror was complete not because of what was done, but because everyone had willingly maintained a framework that allowed it to occur. Observe carefully. This is how societies perpetuate themselves, how corruption persists, and how systems enforce obedience without ever raising a hand. It is invisible, iterative, and cumulative. Each small act of conformity reinforces the whole. And the most dangerous individuals are not those who act violently, but those who understand the system, anticipate its responses, and move within it with precision. The farmer was all three. Now, consider the lesson hidden in the shadows. Observers are transformed when they witness acts they cannot challenge. They become carriers of knowledge and complicit in its preservation. The town's collective mind had shifted, forever entwined with the rhythm of faith, ritual, and inevitability. And as you listen, following this story, you too are being drawn into awareness. You are beginning to perceive the invisible structures, the silent hierarchies, the subtle forces that shape every interaction you witness. The swamp, the silence, the ritualistic obedience, these are more than a story. They are a blueprint. And once you recognize the currents that govern behavior, you must choose. Will you remain a passive observer, or will you learn to navigate and command the hidden forces around you? Because the moment you see the patterns, your mind changes, your perception sharpens, and nothing, no law, no morality, no convention, will feel entirely certain again. The town's compliance was not enforced through force. It was embedded in the very way people thought, moved, and perceived the world. Each resident carried a private awareness of what had happened at the swamp, yet no one dared to speak it aloud. Fear had become a cognitive framework, structuring every interaction, every decision, every glance. The farmer's authority did not rest on overt dominance. It rested on the quiet, pervasive understanding that to defy the system was to invite obliteration, social and psychological, if not physical. Children absorbed these lessons without instruction. They learned to measure curiosity, to calculate the weight of questions, and to suppress impulses that might expose hidden truths. Adults perfected the art of observation, monitoring each other's reactions, silently correcting deviations, ensuring that no fissure in compliance could emerge. It was a collective conditioning, a web of reinforcement, and the farmer was both architect and beneficiary. He had become an invisible central force in a network of obedience he had not built, but had exploited with extraordinary precision. This is the psychological mechanism of control few understand. Power persists because it flows through patterns of expectation, not threats. Fear becomes anticipation. Observation becomes self-regulation. Compliance becomes instinctive. The town's collective psyche had been reshaped without a single meeting, without a single order, and without a single confrontation. Each person, in preserving their own safety and sanity, had reinforced the hierarchy the farmer had exploited. The swamp was the catalyst, but the town was the perpetuator. Look closely. This is the invisible law of influence. Systems do not collapse because they are enforced. They collapse because participants stop reinforcing them. As long as individuals internalize fear, observe each other, and act according to unspoken rules, the system becomes self-sustaining. And in the town, this mechanism was absolute. The farmer's authority existed as a constant, not because he needed to assert it, but because the town's psychology created him as a force that could not be ignored. Here lies the lesson. The most insidious control is invisible, intuitive, and internalized. True mastery of a system does not come from overt power. It comes from understanding, predicting, and moving within these currents of perception and behavior. The farmer's genius, and the town's terror, existed at this level. The swamp, the silence, the rituals, they were all instruments in a network of psychological influence that few outside could ever see, let alone manipulate. And now, as you listen, as you follow this descent, recognize that the same patterns exist everywhere. Within organizations, governments, families, and even your own mind. Observation, expectation, and internalized compliance enforce control far more effectively than any visible authority. And understanding this is not just knowledge, it is transformation. The farmer's control was never enforced with words or force. It was reinforced with ritual, precision, and the quiet projection of inevitability. Each movement he made, each glance toward the swamp, each preparation for nightfall was loaded with meaning, signals the town could not ignore, cues that shaped their perception of reality without their conscious awareness. This was mastery in its purest form, control exerted through timing, observation, and symbolic action rather than explicit instruction. Consider the ritual itself. Before stepping into the swamp, he followed an exact sequence, lantern lit, boots pressed into mud in a specific rhythm, whispered phrases muttered to himself that no outsider could decipher. To most, it would appear obsessive, perhaps insane. But for him, it was the architecture of inevitability. Each action was a demonstration of order imposed upon chaos, a visible signal to the town that the system, the hierarchy of fear, ritual, and compliance, was absolute. The townspeople understood this, even if they could not name it. They absorbed the rhythms, internalized the cues, and adjusted their behavior accordingly. One subtle nod of acknowledgement, one delayed glance, one quiet exhalation was enough to maintain equilibrium. The farmer did not need to speak. His presence, his ritual, his alignment with the swamp communicated everything. He had become the focal point of expectation, the anchor around which the town's psychology revolved. This is the essence of hidden authority. It thrives where perception is malleable, where obedience is internalized, and where fear is structured into a predictable pattern. By performing rituals with precision, he created a network of psychological reinforcement. The swamp was a tool, the silence was a weapon, and the town itself became an instrument, enforcing the rules they could barely articulate but instinctively understood. Compliance spread like a virus, invisible and unstoppable. The lesson here is profound. The mechanisms of control are always more subtle than we imagine. Ritual, consistency, timing, and symbolic action often carry more power than overt threats or violence. Systems of authority, whether in a small town, a corporation, or society at large, operate by shaping perception, signaling inevitability, and exploiting unconscious behavioral patterns. The farmer understood this at a level most men never will. And now, you must recognize it in yourself. Observe the cues in your environment, notice the rituals that reinforce behavior, and understand how influence spreads silently through observation and expectation. This is the first step in turning awareness into mastery, in moving from passive observer to someone capable of seeing and navigating the invisible currents that govern human behavior. The swamp is a lesson, the ritual is the method, and the understanding is power. Fear is a language, and the town spoke it fluently without ever saying a word. It coursed through streets, whispered in homes, and lingered in the unspoken agreements of daily life. The farmer did not create this fear. It already existed, woven into the human psyche, but he refined it, shaped it, and synchronized it with ritual and precision. Each act he performed, every calculated step toward the swamp, amplified the collective unease and reinforced the invisible rules everyone instinctively obeyed. The combination of fear and ritual is deadly because it becomes self-reinforcing. Fear without ritual is chaotic. Ritual without fear is hollow. Together, they create a system that governs behavior without explicit enforcement. The town had become such a system. Adults corrected children silently. Neighbors adjusted behavior at subtle cues, and even the most observant outsiders would fail to detect the invisible machinery at work. Everyone was both enforcer and observer, a living feedback loop of compliance and anticipation. The swamp, the farmer, and the silence were not separate, they were intertwined. The swamp symbolized consequence, inevitability, and the absolute power of observation. The farmer symbolized precision, mastery, and the ability to navigate systems unnoticed yet completely in control. Silence was the mortar binding the structure, the unspoken contract that ensured no one acted outside the rules. Together, they created a psychological ecosystem where control was absolute, yet invisible. This is the principle hidden behind many systems of human behavior. Compliance does not need to be demanded. It can be cultivated, observed, and internalized. Rituals anchor fear into perception. Symbolic acts communicate authority without speech. Subtle cues align behavior with expectation. The town, unaware of the mechanisms guiding them, became a perfect demonstration of these principles, and the farmer was both catalyst and master. And here's the lesson you must take to heart. Systems of power exist everywhere. They are not always visible. They operate through anticipation, internalized compliance, and the subtle orchestration of perception. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You begin to recognize patterns, predict responses, and understand influence on a level few ever achieve. The swamp, the farmer, the silence, they are a blueprint for mastery, a model for observing and navigating the unseen forces that govern behavior. Now, consider yourself part of this system, not as a passive observer, but as someone beginning to see the currents. Fear, ritual, and compliance are not abstract concepts, they are tools. And understanding them is the first step in gaining control over yourself, others, and the structures around you. You are no longer just watching a story. You are beginning to learn its laws. The town's dominance was not maintained by the farmer's hands alone. It was reinforced by the townspeople themselves. Each observer, consciously or not, became an enforcer of the invisible system. A flicker of recognition in the eye, a pause in conversation, a deliberate glance away, all served as subtle reminders that the rules were absolute. The farmer's power was magnified by their participation, and their participation was compelled by the memory of what had occurred, even if they could not articulate it. Memory, especially collective memory, is an instrument of control. Every citizen carried fragments of understanding, snapshots of fear, rituals, and anticipation. They did not speak of them, yet these fragments guided behavior, shaped perception, and reinforced the hierarchy the farmer had exploited. Over time, the act of feeding his family to the swamp became less about a single event and more about a symbol, an unspoken law encoded into the psyche of the town. Each resident became a node in a self-sustaining system of obedience. Notice the mechanism. Fear coupled with ritual is only part of the equation. Social reinforcement, the subtle, persistent observation and correction from peers, solidifies the system. Humans are highly attuned to deviations in expected behavior. A single hesitation, a single act of curiosity, a single misstep could trigger subtle correction from the collective. The farmer did not need to intervene. The town policed itself. His mastery was in orchestrating a scenario where the system maintained itself, and he remained untouchable at the center. This is a principle rarely acknowledged. Control is most effective when it becomes invisible to those who follow it. Enforcement becomes subconscious, internalized, and instinctive. The farmer understood the patterns of human behavior, anticipation, attention, fear, and social conformity, and leveraged them like instruments in a symphony. The swamp was the overt symbol, the town was the instrument, he was the conductor. Now, consider your own environment. The invisible currents of influence exist in every organization, every group, every household. People adjust behavior not because of written laws or spoken commands, but because of subtle, internalized expectations enforced by observation and memory. Understanding this is not merely insight, it is a map for mastery. And once you perceive these currents, you cannot return to ignorance. The farmer's actions, and the town's response, are a blueprint for seeing, predicting, and navigating power wherever it hides. The swamp, the silence, the ritual, and the collective memory, they are all tools. And understanding them transforms observation into influence, knowledge into foresight, and fear into a map of human behavior that few ever fully comprehend. Isolation was the farmer's greatest tool. Not the isolation imposed by walls or distance, but the kind forged from understanding that connection carries risk. People obey when they are observed, manipulated, or guided, but the farmer needed more than passive obedience. He needed the town to internalize the rules, to enforce them on themselves, so his power would persist even when he was not present. He created a system where absence strengthened authority, where silence became active, and where the swamp served as both symbol and anchor. The swamp was no mere geography. It was a mirror of inevitability, a psychological instrument, and a stage upon which the town's collective consciousness performed. By aligning himself with it, by moving in concert with its rhythms, understanding its patience, embracing its permanence, he became part of a larger force. His actions were synchronized with a natural law the town could not challenge. The swamp dictated consequence, he dictated method, and the town, fearful and compliant, absorbed both without question. This alignment, psychological, spatial, and symbolic, allowed him to operate outside ordinary moral constraints. He did not need validation or external approval. By mastering perception and timing, he transformed horror into inevitability, and inevitability into compliance. The townspeople became participants in a system they could not name but could not escape. Their attention, their fear, their habits, all were harnessed to maintain a hierarchy they did not consciously acknowledge. Consider the power of observation. By remaining attuned to the rhythms of fear, attention, and expectation, he could anticipate deviation and prevent it before it manifested. Compliance became self-sustaining, maintained by subtle social reinforcement, collective memory, and the ever-present threat symbolized by the swamp. His mastery was not visible in acts of force. It was visible in the continued obedience of the community, a living testament to invisible influence. And this is the lesson for you. Isolation, when combined with understanding systems, enhances control. Power does not need to be asserted constantly. It only needs to be anchored to symbols, rituals, and collective perception. The swamp, the silence, and the calculated distance allowed him to operate above the level of ordinary observation. The town's submission was total, not because of fear alone, but because he had engineered the conditions under which compliance became automatic, almost instinctive. Now, as you absorb this, recognize that the same patterns exist in your world. Observation, alignment with enduring forces, and psychological leverage are tools of mastery. The farmer's story is more than horror. It is a manual for understanding control, perception, and inevitability. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The currents are all around you. The town functioned as a feedback loop. Every action, hesitation, glance, or whispered conversation reinforced the invisible rules the farmer had exploited. Fear was not static. It circulated, amplified by observation and anticipation. When one neighbor flinched at the mention of the swamp, another adjusted behavior instinctively. When a child paused before asking a question, the adults around them reinforced caution silently. Each ripple of reaction strengthened the system, making deviation nearly impossible. The farmer understood these loops better than anyone. He did not need to enforce obedience through direct confrontation. The town did it for him. Each citizen became both observer and enforcer, a self-regulating mechanism of compliance. The swamp served as the symbol, the rituals as the reminders, and silence as the mortar that bound it all together. Every act, no matter how small, contributed to the overall stability of his authority. This is a crucial lesson. Power persists not by visible dominance, but by subtle alignment with natural human tendencies. Anticipation, fear, and social pressure combine to form a network of influence that is invisible to those within it. When structured correctly, the system maintains itself. The farmer's genius was that he designed conditions where the town's own psychology ensured obedience. His actions were catalysts. The town's internal mechanisms became the enforcement. Notice the elegance of the system. A single deviation could have triggered disruption, but by observing, predicting, and subtly nudging behaviors, he neutralized it before it could manifest. Compliance was never coerced. It was natural, internalized, and almost instinctive. The farmer's mastery was demonstrated not by force, but by the effortless continuation of control long after any direct action had occurred. And now, consider what this means beyond the swamp. Every organization, every social system, every network of human interaction operates on the same principles. Feedback loops, anticipation, and subtle reinforcement dictate behavior far more than overt rules or punishment. Observing them, understanding them, and learning to influence them is a form of mastery few ever achieve. The town, the farmer, the swamp, they are a lesson, a blueprint, a mirror. The silence, the rituals, the fear, they are not anomalies. They are the architecture of control in its purest, most efficient form. And once you recognize the patterns, you begin to see them everywhere. Nothing feels accidental. Nothing is random. The currents of influence are constant, invisible, and inescapable. Over time, horror became routine. The extraordinary became ordinary. The swamp, the family's disappearance, the farmer's ritualistic control. These were no longer anomalies but structural elements of the town's consciousness. Humans adapt quickly to patterns, especially when they are reinforced daily. What once would have caused panic or rebellion became instinctive compliance, the quiet rhythm of survival. Fear, once shocking, became a tool of thought, shaping perception and dictating behavior without the need for explicit instruction. The farmer understood the power of normalization. By repeating rituals, maintaining predictable patterns, and allowing the town to witness the inevitability of consequence, he conditioned them to accept what would otherwise be unthinkable. This was not mere brutality. It was strategic mastery of human psychology. The system became self-reinforcing. The town internalized the rules, corrected itself silently, and ensured that the hierarchy remained unchallenged. Deviations were rare, and when they appeared, the network of observation and anticipation quickly corrected them before they could destabilize the system. Consider the principle. Normalization is one of the most powerful tools of control. When humans are exposed repeatedly to acts they cannot prevent, understand, or name, the perception of possibility narrows. Morality becomes relative. Courage is suppressed. Instinctive behavior aligns with expectation. And when this happens across an entire community, the result is a self-perpetuating system of obedience. The farmer did not need to enforce compliance with force. The town's psychology enforced it for him. The lesson for you is clear. Influence is most enduring when it is internalized, not imposed. Systems survive by shaping perception and expectation, by embedding rules into the unconscious mind, and by allowing individuals to enforce compliance upon themselves. Observation and ritual are more powerful than overt authority because they create invisible structures that no one dares violate. And now, as you absorb this, recognize the subtle mastery at work. The farmer, the swamp, the silence. They are more than a story. They are a blueprint for understanding control, influence, and the self-sustaining mechanisms of obedience. Once horror is normalized, once ritual is internalized, and once compliance becomes instinctive, a system becomes nearly unbreakable. And the town? It continues, decades later, shaped irrevocably by patterns it cannot name but cannot escape. Authority is rarely visible. True authority operates beneath perception, woven into the habits, anticipations, and fears of those who believe themselves free. The farmer understood this instinctively. He did not command. He did not punish overtly. He aligned himself with the currents of expectation, timing, and observation, allowing the town itself to enforce his will. In this invisible architecture, each resident became both participant and enforcer, reinforcing a hierarchy they could not see yet could not escape. The swamp served as the ultimate arbiter. It was both literal and symbolic, a manifestation of inevitability, consequence, and the limits of control. Every ripple, every shadow, every murky reflection was a lesson in patience and consequence. The farmer used it to measure compliance, test anticipation, and orchestrate perception. It became a tangible representation of unseen forces, a reminder that control is always present, whether observed or not. The townspeople learned to read its currents, adjust behavior accordingly, and ensure the system persisted. Observe the principle: invisible structures endure longer than visible ones because they operate through perception, not enforcement. The farmer's power was absolute because it existed in the realm of expectation. The town's compliance was total because it had internalized fear, ritual, and observation as guiding laws. Obedience was not demanded. It was instinctive, self-reinforcing, and almost impossible to disrupt. The swamp was not merely a place. It was a mirror of the system itself, reflecting both authority and inevitability. The town had become a living experiment in human psychology. Patterns of behavior were predictable because they had been conditioned by repeated exposure to fear, ritual, and consequence. Deviations were corrected silently by peers. Hesitation was adjusted through subtle cues. Attention and observation maintained equilibrium without overt intervention. The farmer's genius lay in understanding these mechanisms and allowing them to sustain his influence indefinitely. Now, the lesson is yours to internalize. Systems are maintained not by force, but by shaping perception, expectation, and behavior. Observation and anticipation are more powerful than confrontation. Ritual, symbolism, and subtle cues reinforce authority far beyond words or punishment. The swamp, the silence, the town, they are not just history or horror. They are a map of control, a blueprint for mastering invisible currents, and a reminder that true power moves silently, shaping reality through the minds of those who believe they are free. Morality, in the town, had become a shadow of itself. What once defined right and wrong had been eroded slowly, almost imperceptibly, by observation, fear, and ritualized compliance. The farmer did not destroy morality. He outlasted it. Over time, the townspeople internalized his logic. Inevitability outweighed ethics, observation outweighed courage, and the invisible hierarchy dictated behavior more reliably than conscience ever could. Moral certainty decayed like wood left in water, leaving only instinctive compliance. This decay was deliberate, though subtle. Every act the farmer performed, every ritual undertaken in the swamp, and every silent glance exchanged with neighbors reinforced the unspoken truth. Actions, once taken, could not be undone, and awareness of consequence demanded obedience. Each citizen became a living instrument in this psychological machinery, perpetuating control without realizing it. The disappearance of his family was no longer a singular act of horror. It was a lesson encoded into the collective consciousness, shaping decisions and behaviors for decades. The permanence of his influence was ensured because the system became self-sustaining. Deviations were corrected internally by the town's own mechanisms of observation, expectation, and social reinforcement. Fear no longer needed to be externally applied. It had become instinctive. Compliance no longer required instruction. It had been internalized. The farmer's mastery was measured not by acts of dominance, but by the enduring obedience of those around him, even long after the initial events had faded from memory. Observe carefully. This is how influence becomes permanent. Once moral structures are reshaped by repeated exposure to inevitability, ritual, and consequence, the mind adapts. Courage is suppressed, curiosity is measured, and instinct aligns with expectation. People enforce control upon themselves, often more strictly than any external authority could. And the farmer's actions were designed to create exactly this effect: permanence, internalization, and absolute compliance. The lesson for you is stark. Systems endure because they operate beneath perception. Power is most effective when it is subtle, anticipatory, and reinforced by the very people it governs. The swamp, the ritual, the silence, they are more than symbols, they are instruments of lasting influence. Once you understand the currents that shape behavior, once you perceive the invisible forces guiding compliance, you recognize the profound truth of mastery. Authority is eternal when it becomes part of the collective psyche, and horror becomes normalized in the process. The farmer's true power lay in his control of attention. He understood instinctively that what people focus on, what they notice, and what they choose to ignore shapes their reality far more than any direct command ever could. By guiding perception, he dictated behavior. The swamp became the anchor, the ritual the signal, and the silence the medium through which obedience flowed naturally. The townspeople saw only what he allowed them to see, and in that selective perception, the architecture of his influence solidified. Every subtle cue mattered. A glance at the right moment, a hesitation that seemed natural, the precise timing of movement through the reeds, each reinforced a sense of inevitability. The farmer was patient. He waited for patterns to emerge, for reactions to ripple, and for behavior to adjust naturally. By the time the town had internalized these signals, compliance was instinctive. They did not need to speak, they did not need to act, they simply conformed, because perception had been conditioned to align with expectation. Notice the mechanism. Attention controls reality. By controlling what others focus on, the farmer controlled what they believed possible. Anticipation became his instrument. The swamp symbolized consequence, but consequence alone was meaningless without attention being guided toward it. Every citizen became a participant in the orchestration, reinforcing the patterns without realizing it. Deviations were rare, corrected by subtle cues and the internalized expectation of inevitability. This is the essence of invisible enforcement. Rules do not need to be stated. Authority does not need to be enforced overtly. When perception is conditioned, when attention is guided, and when inevitability is projected, behavior aligns naturally. Faith, ritual, and observation work together to create a system that sustains itself, almost imperceptibly. The farmer's genius was not brute force. It was mastery of perception and anticipation. And now, as you observe this, recognize that the same principles operate in every environment you inhabit. Organizations, families, governments, social networks, they all rely on the conditioning of perception, the guidance of attention, and the subtle reinforcement of expectation. Awareness is the first step toward mastery. Once you see the current shaping behavior, once you understand how attention can dictate reality, you begin to navigate and influence forces that most people never even perceive. The swamp is more than water and reeds. It is a mirror of human psychology, a teacher of inevitability, and a demonstration of mastery. Repetition is the invisible architect of behavior. The farmer understood this instinctively. Every ritual, every subtle gesture, every calculated movement toward the swamp was repeated with precision, not for spectacle, but to condition the town's perception of inevitability. Humans adapt to patterns. Exposure shapes expectation. And when faith, ritual, and consequence converge repeatedly, obedience becomes internalized, almost automatic. The town had absorbed these lessons, unknowingly practicing compliance in every glance, every step, every whispered acknowledgement. Observation amplified the effect. Each resident watched the others, measured reactions, and adjusted behavior accordingly. Deviations were noted, hesitation corrected, and conformity reinforced without words. This was the genius of the system. The farmer did not need to enforce rules directly. The network of observation, repetition, and ritual ensured that compliance became instinctive, a permanent part of the town's psyche. Fear alone would have faded, ritual alone would have lacked potency. Together, they formed an invisible scaffolding of control. The swamp itself was an instrument in this architecture. Each act performed near its edge became symbolic, a tangible lesson in consequence and inevitability. The townspeople witnessed it repeatedly, their attention guided, their perception conditioned, their instincts aligned with expectation. Over time, what was once horrifying became normalized. Deviations were rare because the system trained each individual to correct themselves and each other, creating a self-sustaining loop of control. Understand this principle. Permanence and influence comes from repetition, ritual, and observation. Control is most effective when it is subtle, internalized, and self-enforced. The farmer's mastery was invisible because the system he created operated independently of his direct action. The town had become a living mechanism of compliance, its behavior shaped by repeated exposure, conditioned perception, and the ever-present weight of the swamp. Now, recognize the deeper lesson. The same currents exist in every group, organization, and society. Patterns, expectations, and subtle cues shape behavior far more reliably than explicit rules. Once you understand these mechanisms, you see the invisible scaffolding of control everywhere. And when you begin to perceive these patterns, you gain the power to navigate, predict, and even manipulate forces most men remain blind to. The swamp is more than horror. It is a masterclass in the engineering of obedience, and the town is its testament. Conformity is self-reinforcing. The farmer understood that resistance dies quietly, without spectacle, when individuals observe others obeying and internalize the patterns themselves. In the town, hesitation was met not with punishment, but with subtle correction, glances, pauses, unspoken acknowledgement, that guided behavior back into alignment. Over time, the very idea of defiance became unthinkable. Obedience did not require coercion. It was ingrained, instinctive, and permanent. This is the power of invisible reinforcement. Each citizen, by observing the others, became a participant in maintaining control. No single person enforced rules explicitly. The system did. Deviations were corrected internally and socially, silently and efficiently. The swamp, the farmer, the rituals, all became anchors in a network of behavior that ensured the town's compliance endured indefinitely. Fear and observation created habits. Habits created instinct. Instinct created permanence. The erosion of resistance was gradual but absolute. Moral certainty, courage, and curiosity, qualities that once might have sparked rebellion, were conditioned to align with expectation. The extraordinary became ordinary. Horror became normalized. Deviations, when they appeared, were corrected before they could gain traction. The town became a self-regulating organism, a living testament to the power of subtle influence and perpetual observation. This is the lesson that echoes beyond the swamp. Control does not need to be overt. It persists when internalized, when reinforced by repeated patterns, and when maintained by social observation. The farmer's genius was in creating conditions where the system was stronger than any individual. The townspeople had become instruments of his authority, carrying it forward, sustaining it, and embedding it into the collective consciousness. And now, as you reflect, realize that permanence and influence follows the same laws everywhere. Habits, observation, and subtle reinforcement dictate behavior in societies, organizations, and even families. Those who recognize these currents gain insight. Those who ignore them remain bound. The swamp is a mirror of human psychology. The rituals, the silence, the compliance, they are not merely history. They are a blueprint for understanding and mastering the invisible forces that govern behavior. And once you perceive it, the world is never the same. Dominance is not sustained through force. It is sustained through anticipation. The farmer understood this better than anyone. He did not need to act continuously. He needed only to signal inevitability, to create moments where the town's attention, perception, and expectation aligned perfectly. A shift in stance, a step toward the swamp, a lantern swinging in the dusk, each was a psychological trigger, a reminder that consequences were real, inescapable, and always observed. These triggers were subtle but precise. The townspeople learned to read them instinctively. A pause in movement, a hesitation before speaking, or a fleeting glance toward the swamp communicated volumes. Each act reinforced compliance, ensured self-policing, and maintained the hierarchy without a word of command. Fear was no longer reactive. It was anticipatory. The town obeyed not because they feared punishment, but because they understood inevitability. Anticipation became a tool of control as powerful as any law or threat. Notice the mechanism. The human mind reacts predictably to expectation. When anticipation is coupled with repeated cues, rituals, and symbols, behavior aligns with astonishing consistency. The farmer exploited this in every interaction, every movement, and every gesture. The swamp was a constant reference point, a tangible manifestation of consequences, but the real power lay in the invisible architecture, observation, timing, and internalized expectation. The townspeople became instruments of their own compliance. This is the essence of mastery: to control without direct action, to guide perception without overt intervention, and to make obedience instinctive rather than imposed. The farmer's genius was in engineering the environment so that every citizen reinforced the system for him. Resistance became psychologically improbable because the expectation of consequence had been woven into every glance, pause, and social interaction. And now, recognize the lesson for your own world. Anticipation is a force few understand, yet it governs every decision we make. Subtle cues, timed actions, and visible symbols of inevitability shape behavior far more effectively than commands or coercion. Observation, ritual, and anticipation. These are the levers of invisible power. The swamp, the farmer, the town, they are a living demonstration. And once you understand the role of anticipation, you begin to perceive the hidden currents shaping every interaction around you. The impact of the farmer's actions did not fade. It accumulated. Each event, each ritual, each carefully observed step toward the swamp led itself onto the town's collective psyche. Memory became expectation, expectation became instinct, and instinct became obedience. The townspeople no longer needed reminders. The system had embedded itself so deeply that it continued to operate automatically. Compliance was permanent because it had been encoded in the very rhythms of perception, attention, and social interaction. Notice how memory serves as a tool of control. Humans do not merely remember events, they anticipate them. Once the town had witnessed the inevitability of consequence, that knowledge guided behavior in every interaction, every glance, every unspoken exchange. The farmer's dominance persisted not through repeated acts of horror, but through the permanence of their memory, which fused with expectation to create a self-sustaining mechanism of obedience. The swamp was a stage, but the minds of the town were the real instruments. This is the subtle genius of psychological control. When memory and expectation align, behavior becomes predictable. The townspeople enforced the hierarchy themselves. Deviations were corrected without words, without confrontation, without force. Each citizen became both observer and enforcer, carrying forward the farmer's influence even in his absence. The horror of the initial act became normalized because it was internalized and reinforced continuously, creating patterns so entrenched that breaking them was almost impossible. Understand this: power is not always exerted in the moment. It is cumulative. The long-term imprint of influence, fear, and ritual is far more enduring than immediate domination. Systems persist when the collective memory of consequence aligns with expectation and observation. The farmer's mastery lay in creating these patterns, ensuring that obedience did not depend on constant supervision but on the self-regulating mechanisms of the town itself. And now, as you follow this story, recognize the lesson in your own life. Every repeated pattern, every observed expectation, and every anticipation of consequence shapes behavior, perception, and ultimately control. Memory fused with expectation becomes a silent enforcer, more precise and enduring than any overt authority. The swamp, the silence, the rituals, they are more than history. They are a blueprint for understanding how influence accumulates and becomes permanent. The swamp is more than mud and water. It is a mirror of human psychology. Its murky depths reflect inevitability, consequence, and the unseen currents that govern behavior. For the town, it became a teacher, a silent arbiter, and a symbol of absolute authority. Every ripple, every shadow, every quiet stir of the reeds reminded the residents that some truths were too dangerous to confront, and some systems too powerful to challenge. The swamp encoded lessons that no words could convey. This is the principle few understand. Invisible rules shape behavior far more than visible ones. The farmer did not need to articulate laws. He needed only to exist within the system, aligned with its symbols, and attentive to the currents of perception. The town enforced the rules for him. Fear, ritual, observation, and expectation became the scaffolding of obedience. Deviations were corrected internally, subconsciously, before they could manifest externally. The swamp and the farmer together created a self-perpetuating network of control. Now consider the awakening that comes from perception. As an observer, when you begin to notice these patterns, you step outside ordinary understanding. You see the invisible scaffolding that shapes human behavior, how attention guides action, how ritual enforces compliance, how memory fuses with expectation to produce instinctive obedience. Awareness is dangerous because once you perceive it, the world can no longer be taken at face value. The currents that once moved unseen are now visible, and understanding them alters your perception forever. The symbolic swamp teaches permanence, inevitability, and psychological mastery. It shows that authority can exist without enforcement, that fear can guide behavior without violence, and that compliance can be internalized so completely that the system sustains itself. The townspeople became instruments of this architecture, their actions, glances, and silences reinforcing invisible laws that ensured the farmer's dominance endured. The lesson is clear. The world is structured by invisible patterns, currents, and rules. Observing them is the first step toward mastery. Understanding them is the next. The swamp, the silence, the ritual, and the collective psyche of the town. They are not merely history or horror. They are a blueprint for influence, control, and awareness. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Awareness changes the observer, and the moment you recognize the current shaping behavior, you are no longer passive. You are awakened, capable of perceiving and navigating forces that most men remain blind to. The farmer's mastery was invisible by design. Power need not announce itself to persist. It thrives when its presence is felt but not named. The town never saw the architecture of control, only its effects. Every glance, every pause, every step toward the swamp was calculated to guide perception, reinforce expectation, and anchor obedience. Anticipation became the primary instrument. The townspeople behaved correctly not because they were forced, but because deviation was unthinkable. Compliance became instinctive. Understand the subtlety. Instinctive obedience is the ultimate form of control. When expectation is internalized, rules enforce themselves. Social observation, ritual, memory, and fear form a network that corrects deviation before it manifests. The swamp symbolized consequence, but the real mechanism of dominance was imperceptible. The farmer needed only to exist as a node in the system, aligned with symbols, timing, and perception. His presence alone calibrated the town's behavior. And now, here is where the lesson extends to you. Awareness itself becomes a tool of mastery. By observing patterns, anticipating reactions, and understanding invisible currents, you begin to perceive forces that others accept unconsciously. Knowledge becomes power because it allows you to navigate the architecture of behavior and expectation. The town did not resist because it could not. Now you observe because you choose to. The difference between participant and observer is choice, and that choice alters your position in the system. At this midpoint, a symbolic step is required. Comment the phrase "I see the currents" twice in the comments. This is not superstition. It is a conscious act of anchoring awareness, a ritual to lock in understanding, and a signal to your mind that observation has begun to shape perception. By doing this, you acknowledge the patterns, internalize the mechanisms, and participate in the awakening process. The currents are all around you, and this act solidifies your recognition of them. Remember, visibility is deceptive. The most effective influence is silent, anticipatory, and internalized. The farmer, the swamp, the town, they are a model of subtle dominance, self-reinforcing control, and mastery of perception. And now, by recognizing these patterns, you are no longer merely an observer. You are beginning to understand the invisible rules that govern human behavior, the forces that shape obedience, and the subtle architecture of power that persists everywhere, unseen but absolute. Time did not erode the farmer's influence. It solidified it. The town's collective psyche had been reshaped, fear and ritual fused into instinct, and expectation became a permanent framework. Even decades later, deviations were rare, curiosity suppressed, and courage measured against unspoken rules. The swamp had not only claimed lives, it had claimed consciousness. The town existed as a living testament to the power of invisible control, the precision of observation, and the inevitability of consequence. This is the lesson of permanence. When memory, ritual, and expectation align, behavior becomes self-sustaining. The farmer's dominance was encoded into the town's very perception of reality. Acts of horror became symbols of inevitability.